The photograph arrived in an OSINT analyst's queue at 6:41 on a Tuesday morning in late May. Maxar Worldview 3 tasked over the tree lines south of Polohy in occupied Zaporizhzhia. She had been staring at that same grid square for 11 days. On the 12th image, there it was, a rectangular heat shadow in the wheat stubble, the kind left by a vehicle that had sat in one place long enough to kill the grass beneath its chassis. The vehicle itself was gone, rotated to a new hide site the night before, exactly as the Russian 8th Air Defense Brigade had been doing every 36 to 48 hours since the campaign started. But the shadow was the wrong shape for a logistics truck, too wide, too long. The wheelbase matched a 9A317M transporter erector launcher and radar, a Buk-M3 TELAR to within tolerances. She flagged the image, cross-referenced it against 5 previous clearings she had already cataloged, and typed 3 words into the shared channel, same spot again. Over the next 22 days, that phrase would become a dark joke inside the targeting cell of Ukraine's 14th Unmanned Systems Regiment. Because the Russian crews, despite rotating their hide sites with discipline, kept cycling through the same 6 clearings, and by the time the 8th Buk-M3 burned, Russian telegram channels were no longer calling it bad luck. They were calling it what it was, a systematic failure that had just ripped the air defense screen off Russia's 35th Combined Arms Army at the worst possible moment in the Zaporizhzhia operational theater. In the next 34 minutes, we're going to break down exactly how the 14th UAV Regiment ran this campaign. The targeting cycle, the 3-layer drone architecture they used to find, strike, and confirm each kill. The way Russian rotation discipline actually made their launchers more predictable, not less. And what happened to the Storm Shadow corridor over Berdyansk once 11 Buk-M3 TELARs stopped existing. This is not a story about Ukrainian bravery in the abstract. It is a story about a specific exploit, a pattern embedded in Russian operational logistics, and how a regiment of drone operators turned that pattern into 34 days of methodical destruction. Let's start with the ground. Zaporizhzhia Oblast, in mid-May 2026, was a flat, drying landscape of winter wheat coming to harvest, and tree lines planted as Soviet-era windbreaks along field boundaries. The terrain south of Polohy, the city sits roughly 40 kilometers southeast of Zaporizhzhia city, in Russian-occupied territory, had almost no natural elevation, no hills, no ridgelines. What it had instead were those tree lines, dense enough to break radar line of sight from Ukrainian-held ground, accessible enough via dirt farm tracks to allow a 35-ton TELAR to maneuver without getting stuck in soft soil. For Russian air defense planners, the area was not ideal. It was the best available option. The 35th Combined Arms Army had been responsible for the Russian defensive layer across this axis since late 2023. Within its air defense structure, the 8th Air Defense Brigade was the primary medium-range shield, tasked with protecting rear area logistics nodes, command posts, and the occupied city of Tokmak, a critical rail hub roughly 80 kilometers southeast of Polohy that Russian forces had fortified heavily. Tokmak is the kind of node where losing it, even temporarily, cascades. Rail lines from Crimea converge there. Ammunition transfers happen there. If Ukrainian deep strike systems could reach Tokmak freely, the supply architecture for the entire southern axis would be under sustained pressure. The Buk-M3, designated 9K317M by the Russian military, is the most capable variant of the Buk family. Its 9A317M TELAR carries 4 ready-to-fire 9M317M missiles with a maximum engagement range of approximately 70 kilometers against aircraft and up to 25 kilometers against cruise missiles flying at low altitude. The system's passive phased array radar, integrated into the same vehicle, can acquire targets without relying on a separate acquisition radar, which matters enormously in an environment where emissions mean targeting. A Buk-M3 battery typically consists of a command vehicle, a target acquisition radar vehicle, and between 2 and 6 TELARs. What the 14th UAV Regiment was hunting was not the whole battery, it was the TELARs specifically, the firing units that give the system its reach. Russia had deployed what Ukrainian intelligence assessed as a reinforced battalion set of Buk-M3 systems to screen this arc, with TELARs dispersed in pairs or alone across hide sites from Polohy southwest to Tokmak. The logic was sound. Dispersal means no single strike eliminates the capability, but dispersal creates a logistics problem that would prove fatal. A 9A317M TELAR weighs approximately 35 tons. Moving it requires either paved road or firm compacted soil. In the Zaporizhzhia wheat belt, in late spring, after snowmelt, and before the summer dry season fully sets in, large stretches of the farm track network become soft. That constraint is what forced Russian crews into a rotation pattern using a limited number of cleared, accessible staging areas. OSINT analysts working with geolocated imagery and pattern-of-life data assessed that the 8th Air Defense Brigade's Buk-M3 TELARs were cycling through only 6 viable staging clearings along the arc between Polohy and Tokmak, reusing each one every 4 to 7 days as crews shuffled between positions. The Ukrainian 14th Unmanned Systems Regiment understood this before the campaign began. What they needed was confirmation, reliable enough to justify launching strike assets at a clearing before a TELAR had been visually confirmed there on a given day. Here's what's most surprising about how the 14th approached this. They didn't try to catch the TELARs moving. They tried to catch the clearings. The first phase of the campaign, roughly the first 10 days of the 34, was almost entirely intelligence gathering. FP-1 strike drones, Ukraine's long-range loitering platform, capable of flying several hundred kilometers at low altitude on a pre-programmed route, were modified for this phase to carry imaging payloads rather than warheads on some sorties. Flying at night, using terrain masking to stay below the acquisition envelope of the systems they were surveilling, FP-1S made repeated passes over the 6 identified clearings. The thermal signatures from vehicles, the track patterns in the soil, the compressed vegetation, all of it was being logged. A targeting picture was being built not around where a TELAR was on a given night, but around which clearings were active and when. By day 11, the analyst who had flagged the Maxar shadow could cross-reference 3 separate data streams: satellite imagery, FP-1 overflights, and signals intelligence indicating when the 8th Air Defense Brigade's command net had increased activity consistent with movement orders. The pattern that emerged was not a rigid schedule. Russian crews varied their timing, but it was statistically exploitable. Certain clearings saw activity on certain days. The timing clustered. The path between Clearing 2 and Clearing 5, for example, was used more often on Tuesdays and Fridays than on other days, likely because of a locally paved road section that offered better trafficability. This is where the operation shifted from intelligence gathering to targeting. Worth pausing on, because what the 14th was doing is not how most people imagine drone warfare. This wasn't a reactive strike on a vehicle someone spotted. It was a predictive engagement, positioning a strike asset at a location before the target arrived, based on pattern analysis of the target's behavior over days and weeks. In special operations planning terms, this is a time-sensitive target that had been pre-cleared by pattern of life. Russia had Buk-M3 TELARs active in that area. Ukraine had identified where they would likely be before they got there. The question was whether the targeting cycle could compress fast enough to exploit the window before the TELAR departed again. The answer, initially, was no. The first 2 attempted engagements failed, not because the intelligence was wrong. The TELARs were where the analysis predicted they would be. The strikes failed because the time between final confirmation and weapons on target was too long. On the first attempt, an FP-1 platform launched on a strike profile arrived at the designated clearing 11 minutes after the TELAR had departed. On the second, a Bober-class deep strike drone, Ukraine's heavier platform for hardened targets, with the reported payload capacity that allows it to carry munitions capable of defeating armored vehicle hulls, was redirected mid-flight when a TELAR appeared to have already left its position. The platform was recovered rather than wasted on an empty clearing. Those 2 failures were expensive in time, not in hardware, but they forced a methodological adjustment that would define the rest of the campaign. What the 14th changed was the sequencing of the kill chain. Previously, the cycle ran: FP-1 confirms target presence, strike platform is prepared and launched, Mavic 3T thermal drone pre-positioned for battle damage assessment after the hit. The lag between FP-1 confirmation and strike platform arrival was the vulnerability. To close it, the regiment began pre-positioning Bober-class platforms in loiter orbits over the arc before a target was confirmed. holding them airborne and waiting rather than launching them reactively after confirmation. The FP1 or Mavic 3T doing the confirm pass would data link the targeting solution to the loitering Bober, which could then execute within minutes of confirmation rather than waiting for a launch, transit, and attack sequence that consumed up to 40 minutes. This is not a trivial change. Keeping a strike platform airborne in contested airspace, even at night, incurs risk and cost. But the 14th assessed that the cost of missing targets due to timing lag was higher than the attrition risk to the loitering platforms. The assessment proved correct. The third engagement, on approximately day 13 of the 34-day campaign, was the first successful strike. A Buk-M3 TELAR was confirmed in Clearing 4. The analysts had begun numbering them, at 22:17 local time, by a Mavic 3T thermal drone holding a 4.2-kilometer standoff. The data link went to a Bober already in loiter. The Bober's crew adjusted terminal guidance and the weapon impacted the TELAR at 22:34, 17 minutes from confirmation to detonation. The Mavic 3T, still overhead, captured the post-strike thermal imagery within the first 90 minutes, showing the vehicle's ammunition cook-off and structural collapse. The Ukrainian General Staff's strike report, released the following morning, confirmed 19A317M TELAR destroyed in Zaporizhzhia Oblast. Russian millblogger channels, specifically several Telegram accounts associated with the pro-war community tracking the Zaporizhzhia axis, noted the loss with concern but attributed it to poor discipline by a single crew. They were not wrong about discipline. They were wrong about singularity. The next TELAR confirmation came 4 days later, in Clearing 1. The engagement was faster, 14 minutes from confirmation to impact, then Clearing 6, then Clearing 3. By the 6th confirmed loss, the 8th Air Defense Brigade began issuing internal orders, fragments of which surfaced in intercepted communications assessed as authentic by Ukrainian signals intelligence, instructing crews to vary their departure times and avoid staging in the same clearings on consecutive rotations. The orders were reasonable. They did not solve the underlying problem. The underlying problem was roads, or rather, the absence of alternative ones. The 6 clearings the 14th had catalogued were not 6 out of dozens of viable options. They were, given the vehicle weight and the soil conditions of that spring, essentially all the options accessible to a 35-ton TELAR without recovery assets staged nearby. When Russian crews tried to use alternative sites, 2 subsequent events documented in Russian millblogger posts indicate that at least one TLR became briefly immobilized in soft ground before being recovered, an incident that apparently took several hours and required engineering vehicle support. What strikes me about this dynamic is that the Russian 8th Air Defense Brigade was, in a narrow technical sense, following doctrine. Rotate positions, vary timing, maintain emissions control. The doctrine was correct, but it was doctrine written for a different terrain and a different threat environment. In the flat, road-constrained Zaporizhzhia wheat belt in late May, against an adversary who had spent 11 days mapping the constraint, the doctrine folded, not because Russian crews failed it, because the ground itself failed them. By the 8th confirmed loss, approximately day 23 of the 34-day campaign, Russian Telegram channels had stopped attributing the losses to individual crew failures. One account with a significant following in the Russian military-interested community wrote, and we are translating from Russian here, the 8th Air Defense Brigade Command is sending TELARs back to the same clearings because there are no other clearings. This is not a mystery, this is geography. Someone needs to explain to these officers that the enemy has a map too. The post was accurate, and it was furious. There is a detail in the telemetry data, partially released through Ukrainian ATO veteran channels, that deserves attention, because it illustrates what the 14th UAV Regiment had actually achieved in doctrinal terms, not just in hardware terms. In the early days of the campaign, the first 3 confirmed strikes, the end-to-end engagement cycle, from initial target generation sortie to confirmed battle damage assessment, averaged approximately 11 hours. By the final confirmed strikes in the campaign's last week, that cycle had compressed to under 4 hours. The regiment was learning in real time. Each engagement refined the targeting model, tightened the loiter positioning of strike platforms, and improved coordination between the Mavic 3T observation layer and the Bober strike layer. This compression matters because it is not just an efficiency metric, It is a measure of how quickly Ukrainian operators can respond to the adversary's countermoves. When Russian crews changed their departure windows or tried to time movements during weather windows that degraded drone performance, the 14th's faster cycle allowed more targeting attempts per week. Russia was trying to widen the window for safe movement. Ukraine was shrinking it. Put yourself in the position of the 8th Air Defense Brigade's commanding officer during week 3 of this campaign. You have lost 8 of your most capable medium-range launch vehicles. Your crews are demoralized. Your internal communications have been partially compromised. You don't know exactly how, but you know the enemy is anticipating your movements. You have received orders from above to maintain air defense coverage of the Tokmak logistics node, because without it, Ukrainian deep strike systems can strike freely. But every time you position a TLR close enough to provide that coverage, it gets found and destroyed within days. What is your solution? The 8th Air Defense Brigade's solution, documented in a sequence of subsequent events that OSINT analysts tracked through satellite imagery and signals indicators beginning in early June, was to pull 2 Pantsir 1 batteries forward from rear area duty and use them to provide short-range coverage of the most critical nodes, while the remaining Buk-M3 TELARs were kept further back, out of the wheat belt, at the cost of reduced effective coverage radius. This was a tactically rational decision. It was also exactly what the 14th UAV Regiment had predicted and planned for. Here's the unpopular analysis. The decision to pull Pantsir's batteries forward was not a Russian mistake in isolation. It was the only available move. But it meant that a system optimized for short-range air defense of fixed sites was now being asked to compensate for the absence of medium-range coverage across an 80-kilometer arc. A Pantsir S1 has an engagement envelope of roughly 20 kilometers against aircraft and 12 kilometers against cruise missiles at low altitude. A Buk-M3 battery covers 3 to 4 times that range. Substituting Pantsirs for Buks is not a like-for-like replacement. It is plugging a 40-kilometer gap with a 12-kilometer patch. And it opens something that Russian air defense planners had been successfully preventing for months: a viable corridor for Storm Shadow cruise missiles over the port of Berdyansk. Berdyansk port, on the northern shore of the Sea of Azov in Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia Oblast, had been a significant Russian maritime logistics node since early in the occupation. Ammunition, fuel, and equipment moved through it. The port had been a target for Ukrainian planning for an extended period, but successive attempts to engage it with long-range weapons had been degraded by the Buk-M3 coverage over the approaches from the northwest, the bearing from Ukrainian-held territory from which a Storm Shadow would be most likely to fly. With the Buk-M3 screen thinned by 11 confirmed TELAR losses and the replacement Pantsirs unable to cover the same geometry, that approach angle opened. Ukrainian General Staff reporting and subsequent OSINT analysis of satellite imagery consistent with strike damage indicate that a Storm Shadow strike, or strikes, targeted Berdyansk port infrastructure in the first week of June 2026. Ukrainian official communications described the strikes in general terms, without providing specific damage assessments at the time of our analysis, but satellite imagery reviewed by open-source analysts showed structural damage to a warehouse complex on the port's western quay and what appeared to be damage to crane infrastructure. The causal chain is direct and documented. 11 Buk-M3 TELARs destroyed over 34 days. Air defense coverage degraded. Pantsirs forward deployed as inadequate substitutes. Storm Shadow corridor reopened. Port infrastructure struck. Each link in that chain traces back to a specific decision, a specific vulnerability, and a specific Ukrainian capability. We spent time going back through the open-source record of OSINT commentary on this campaign, and one detail that stays with us is how long it took Russian mill-blogger channels to connect those links explicitly. The individual TELAR losses were noted in real time. The Pantsir redeployment was noted, but the commentary largely treated each event as a separate problem. Crew discipline here, command decisions there, rather than as a coherent campaign running against a single exploitable constraint. By the time the Berdyansk strikes became public, some of the more analytically inclined Russian channels did make the connection retroactively. but the operational damage had already been done. The 14th Unmanned Systems Regiment is not one of the Ukrainian formations that receives extensive Western media coverage. It does not have the profile of Aerorozvidka, the reconnaissance drone organization that has been covered in depth since the early days of the full-scale invasion. The 14th is a newer formation, its structure adapted specifically to the deep strike drone mission rather than to the tactical reconnaissance and close support roles that defined the early Ukrainian drone effort. What the Zaporizhzhia campaign documented is that the regiment has developed a sophisticated targeting methodology, pattern of life analysis, predictive engagement, three-layer drone architecture that goes well beyond the improvised tactics of 2022 and 2023. The three-layer architecture the 14th used is not accidental. It reflects deliberate doctrinal development. The FP1 is the intelligence layer, long-range, patient, able to image a target area repeatedly without itself being a high-value asset. The Bober-class platform is the kinetic layer, heavier, carrying munitions capable of defeating hardened or armored targets, but expensive enough that it cannot be used speculatively. The Mavic 3T is the conformation layer, commercially derived, cheap enough to absorb losses, thermal capable for night operations, able to confirm both target presence before a strike and outcome after. The innovation was not in any of those platforms individually. It was in the integration, specifically, the decision to hold the kinetic layer in loiter rather than launching it reactively, and the use of a pre-positioned observation layer to provide targeting data fast enough to exploit the kinetic layer's already airborne position. Russia had Buk-M3 TELARs equipped with some of the most capable medium-range missile guidance systems in Russian inventory. Ukraine had commercially available thermal cameras, repurposed loitering munitions platforms, and a targeting cell that had spent 11 days mapping clearings from satellite photography. The difference that determined the outcome was not in the hardware, it was methodological. This is a point that gets missed in coverage focused on system designations and payload specifications. 11 Buk-M3 TELARs, at a rough unit value of $30 to $35 million each, represent somewhere between $330 and $385 million in destroyed Russian military equipment. A conservative estimate that does not include the associated command and support vehicles degraded alongside the TLRs. By Oryx open-source confirmed loss standards, which require photographic documentation for each entry, the count of 11 is a floor, not a ceiling. Additional losses that could not be confirmed through available imagery may exist. But more important than the dollar value is what those 11 losses did to Russian operational planning in that sector. The 35th Combined Arms Army's ability to protect its rear areas, logistics nodes, and command posts from Ukrainian precision strike depends on layered air defense. The Buk-M3 provides the medium layer. Without it, or with it severely reduced, every asset inside that coverage envelope becomes more vulnerable. That does not mean Russian logistics in southern Zaporizhzhia collapsed. Other air defense systems remained in the area, and Russian forces adapted their movement timing and dispersion. But the cost of those adaptations rose. Vehicles had to move less predictably. Emission discipline had to increase. More assets had to be dedicated to air defense functions that previously could have been handled by TELARs held in position. These are friction costs that accumulate and reduce the operational capacity of a force fighting on multiple axes simultaneously. The Pantsir batteries pulled forward to plug the gap became, as we noted, the 14th's next set of targets. This second phase of the campaign, which falls outside the 34 days we have focused on here, was still developing at the time of our analysis. But the pattern it was following was recognizable. Identify the replacement system's positioning constraints, build a pattern of life model, apply the same predictive engagement methodology. The Pantsir S1, like the Buk-M3 TELAR, is a large vehicle that requires specific terrain. It generates specific emissions when active. It has a logistics tail that creates its own pattern of movement. The 14th was not done with this arc. It had simply moved to the next layer. What does this campaign tell us about the evolution of Ukrainian deep strike doctrine and about the broader challenge that Russian air defense forces face in an environment where long-range drones are patient, cheap enough to use for reconnaissance, and increasingly capable of coordinated targeting against mobile assets? The honest answer is that it tells us Russia's dispersal doctrine, moving air defense assets frequently to avoid targeting, is running into a fundamental limit that has nothing to do with Russian competence and everything to do with the mathematics of pattern of life analysis. Dispersal reduces the probability of any single strike succeeding, but it does not reduce to zero the probability of a patient adversary learning the dispersal pattern and targeting the pattern itself rather than the individual positions. When the dispersal is constrained by terrain, when the number of viable hide sites is finite and known, dispersal as a tactic can actually increase predictability rather than reducing it. This is not a new insight in military theory. The challenge of protecting mobile high-value assets from an adversary conducting extended pattern-of-life surveillance has been discussed in doctrine since at least the Gulf War, when coalition forces used similar methodologies against Iraqi Scud launchers with mixed but instructive results. What is new in the Zaporizhzhia case is the scale at which Ukraine can now sustain that surveillance using long-range drones, and the speed at which the targeting cycle can execute once a pattern is identified. The historical question this campaign raises, and it's a genuine one, is whether we are watching the emergence of a new targeting methodology that will reshape how all armies think about the survivability of mobile air defense systems, or whether this is a Ukraine-specific exploit that depends on terrain constraints unlikely to exist in other operational environments. The Gulf War analogy is instructive but imperfect. The Zaporizhzhia wheat belt is unusually constrained. Other theaters have more terrain options. But the surveillance capability the 14th is deploying is not terrain-specific. It is a methodology that can be applied wherever patient, low-cost aerial observation is feasible. And that is increasingly everywhere. There is a broader institutional failure documented in the Russian response to this campaign that deserves a direct assessment. The 8th Air Defense Brigade's commanding officers were not, as some Russian commentators suggested, simply incompetent. They were operating within a system that had not given them what they needed to solve their problem: alternative hide sites with road access, or engineering support to prepare new sites, or additional short-range air defense coverage to protect the TELAR crews while they moved. Those resources were not provided because the resource allocation system above them was managing competing demands across a wide front and did not prioritize the terrain preparation problem in the Polohy and Tokmak arc until after the 8th TELAR was already burning. That is a systemic failure, not an individual one. And the distinction matters because systemic failures do not get fixed by replacing commanders. They get fixed by changing the resource allocation process, which is a slower and more expensive fix, and one that Russian forces have not consistently demonstrated the organizational agility to execute under sustained operational pressure. Here's a thought that tends to generate debate. The loss of 11 Buk-M3 TELARs is recoverable for Russia in absolute numbers. Russia's defense industry is producing air defense equipment at a substantial rate. What is not recoverable simply by replacing the vehicles is the systemic failure that allowed a single regiment to execute this campaign over 34 days. The failure to identify the terrain constraint early, to resource alternative sites, to recognize that the dispersal doctrine was creating predictability rather than reducing it. If the doctrinal response to this campaign is to issue new rotation schedules, rather than address the terrain constraint problem structurally, the next Ukrainian regiment with similar capabilities will find the same exploit in the next sector. Where was Russia's ability to learn faster than Ukraine in this instance? Comment your assessment. We read every one. What the 14th UAV Regiment demonstrated over 34 days in the Zaporizhzhia wheat belt cannot be reduced to a weapon system comparison or a strike count. They demonstrated that a sustained, patient, methodologically disciplined targeting campaign, one that treats the enemy's behavior as data to be modeled rather than events to be reacted to, can systematically dismantle a layered air defense capability piece by piece, even when that capability is dispersed, mobile, and operated by trained crews following established doctrine. The 11 burned Buk-M3 TELARs are the visible output. The less visible output is a storm shadow corridor over Berdyansk, a disrupted logistics chain in the Tokmak node area, and a set of replacement Pantsir batteries now under the same analytical attention that destroyed their predecessors. The The campaign did not end the 35th Combined Arms Army's capacity to defend its rear areas, but it raised the cost of that defense substantially, and it did so in a way that will take Russia months and significant industrial and engineering resources to reverse. 3 questions remain genuinely open as of our analysis, and they are worth sitting with rather than resolving artificially. First, could Russia have prevented this campaign at a tactical level? Probably yes, if engineering support to prepare alternative hide sites had been allocated before the campaign began, rather than after it was already underway. The terrain constraint was not a secret. The road network in that area was mappable from commercial satellite imagery. Preparing additional viable staging areas, clearing soil, reinforcing tracks, creating options for teller crews beyond the 6 clearings the 14th catalogued, would have significantly complicated the targeting model. That it was not done suggests either that the constraint was not recognized as exploitable until too late, or that the resources to address it were not available, or both. Second, what does this campaign mean for NATO doctrine on mobile air defense survivability? The alliance has invested heavily in systems like Patriot and NESMs that are mobile but not fast-moving, and that depend on dispersal and emission control for survivability in contested environments. The Zaporizhzhia case is a data point, not a proof, that dispersal without terrain diversity can create exploitable patterns. That is a doctrinal challenge that extends well beyond Ukraine. Third, what is the 14th UAV Regiment's next target set? And does Russia now have enough data about this regiment's methodology to adapt faster than it did in Zaporizhzhia? The second question is the one Russian planners are presumably asking most urgently. The answer matters for how the next phase of this campaign unfolds. If you've followed the analysis this far, subscribe to Shadow Battlefield. We publish OSINT investigations like this one weekly, not headlines, but methodology, sourcing, and the operational logic behind the numbers. If you want to understand how this war is actually being fought, that is what we're here for.